So this is our part 2 of TOWTON. And so we came across a great deal of detail before the break, and now we're going to mop up the battlefield, and this will be a mopping up exercise. One question that was raised, which is a very, very important question. Whenever you see Dan Snow, and whenever you see any of those historians do a reconstruction of this battle, what they will tell you, they will say the arrows were fired over a period of 12 hours, and they will say the bowmen opened up at 12 o'clock, and they fired at 2 o'clock, and they fired at 4 o'clock, and the bowmen of the Yorkists kept firing, and the Lancastrians fired. And Chris said, well, where do all these arrows come from? The thing is, an arrow is quite a big thing, right? And it's quite an expensive thing to make. And usually when you're firing arrows, you have to make them as well. So even if you carried a quiver with 50 arrows in, they will be used up pretty quick. And you're really not going to be able to use the ones that have been cast over to shot at you from the Lancastrians or likewise. Because they might be for different bows, and they will be damaged when they hit the ground. And you start to think that, in fact, after a while, firing arrows, letting loose your arrows, would have been a pointless exercise because you wouldn't have had any arrows to fire. Does that spring to mind, Jane and Gough?
Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah.
So, in other words, I think we found a fault with the lecture. With the history more than anything. So so the other thing as well is I mentioned about earlier on about this idea that when you're fighting, when you're on the high ground, you must never leave. And I made the analogy with the Battle of Hastings, and I think that's all we can go with that, because at Hastings, we don't have any archaeological evidence. We don't have any skeletal remains. We don't have any weapons left behind. At TOWTON, we have the reverse. We have skeletal remains. We have a quite a nice selection of skeletal remains. And this is the plan in front of us as well. And Hastings, we don't. But the one thing they do have in common, Harold's men thought they were winning the battle. They charged at the Duke of Normandy's men. The Duke of Normandy's men turned around, slaughtered them, only to be the Duke of Normandy's men were left fighting a very small number of men, the house guards around Harold. So anyway, back to this lecture itself. As you can see, the bodies in that pit are quite higgledy-piggledy, but these are the lucky ones to be buried. And for us, they're lucky that we can examine them and give them the love and tender care what they deserve. And the question is, how do I know that they were buried straight away? Well, we will go into a little bit of nitty-gritty about that. This plan itself, the red line, who are the people in red, Jane?
The Yorks, is that right?
No, the Lancastrians.
I thought they were the Lancastrians, but then you said that it was the other way around.
No.
In the battle.
No, no. Yeah, no, that's what I meant. I meant it in jest. When we looked at the plan, I said to Keith, "This is confusing. The Yorkists are now in red." See,
yes,
you've done it as well. No, yeah, you're in good company, because I used to think the reverse as well. So the ones in red are the Lancastrians. They're coming down from York, which makes it even more confusing. And I think the very question is, how long were they in the field? Well, usually, if you want to use the example of Sedgemoor, as the Duke of Monmouth is marching to Sedgemoor, he gathers men as he's marching along. By the time he gets to Sedgemoor, he has these miners, he has these croftsmen, he has a regiment of this and that, and he goes to Wells and so on and so on. So by the time they get to Sedgemoor, they're not ready for battle, but they're going to fight. And it's likely that along the way, the Lancastrian army got bigger and bigger, and the last recruiting for the Yorkists would be at Saxton. And I'm hoping that Chris has heard what I've said about Saxton, and he can reply to that after the break, after we've finished. So, and that's interesting enough, actually. When I put this together, what's interesting is you've got cross swords here with the word ferry bridge. Now, there's obviously a little battle on the, what's that going to be, the 26th of March, and obviously they get to Sherburn in Elmet, so they're collecting men as they go along. Basically, you would have had to have said you supported the Orcus, otherwise you'd have been killed. So this is what we're talking about. We've already looked at this, but there's one key thing about this. It brings it, and by the way, Jane, the Yorkists are in white this time. So no, I as I say, I've made the same mistake. And I think the point that Keith made is that roses and all the rest of it, you know. Let's move on. So we've already mentioned the events. Obviously, the Yorkists are firing up the hill at the Lancastrians. They've got the wind behind them and the rain behind them. And they're hitting the Lancastrians. The Lancastrians eventually leave their guarded position on the hill, attack the Yorkists. They're beating the Yorkists in this bloody meadow, which must have been so named afterwards. But I think the key thing is the upland area. This is a commanding area. This is a space that they should not have left. They could have held the battle out. They could have kept the battle going on their terms until the next day when the wind would have changed. And I think an analogy could be made between Waterloo on this one, that Napoleon wanted to remain at his position until his reserves turned up. Ney attacked the coalition, and obviously things changed in the battle. You know, things in history repeat. You can see the same mistakes these generals are making over and over again. So, and this is also a key road because to London. So that's going to be key to all of this. So again, what I need to do, I need to just put something around there. So I've got my little crossbar that you can't see. And moving to hither. Now, this is rather interesting. I didn't... it's known as the Cockback or the Cock River. And you can see the site Saxton marked on there. And this is dating sometime at the beginning of the 1800s. And on the map, it clearly shows that in the 1800s, you've got marked graves. Now, we don't know where these graves are now. They might still be there, but there's one thing clearly showing on this: the ground that the Lancastrians were defending over the rest of the landscape. Again, generals make mistakes, and those mistakes are sometimes fatal. And this is the only bit of the battle that I haven't mentioned. I mentioned the early stuff, and I mentioned the Cockback, but one key detail I have missed out up until now. What happens is, as the Lancastrians are engaged with the Yorkists, winning, at this point, there are no rains of arrows, but, you know, let's leave that where it is. One thing that happens is that another army joins the field. The army led by the Duke of Norfolk. Now, here we go overnight, we change the story. The Duke of Norfolk, why is the Duke of Norfolk in the battle when he's not a Yorkist or a Lancastrian? And you're thinking, well, that goes to everything that we've said. It's a battle between North and South, or what have you. Now, again, another thing that could be learned from history. At the Battle of Bosworth, August 1485, Richard should have learned the perils of the past. The Stanleys were waiting on the battlefield to join the winning side, or the side that they wished to fight on. Richard would have been aware of a similar thing happening 20 plus years earlier at the Battle of TOWTON. He did not learn from that, and Richard III was eventually defeated at Bosworth. What happens is that there's a huge melee. The entire Lancastrian army, instead of going back up the hill, the high land that they abandoned, Norfolk was aware of this, and they pushed them into the bloody meadow, away from their safe position, forcing the Lancastrians across the river in complete retreat, clogging up this river with bodies. The bridges would break. In other words, it was a complete rout, and more of the Lancastrians died in the retreat than actually died in the battle. It was likely at that stage, before Norfolk arrived on the battlefield, there were more dead Yorkists than there were Lancastrians. What could you have done about this? Well, we know what they could have done about this. Don't leave the high ground. Again, I keep saying to you people, we must learn from history. History is a vessel for us to require information to help us change the outcome in the future. We've seen this outbreak that we've just had, and we've not learned messages from the past. You know, I've read stuff, not off the internet, but which is not a good thing. You read things like, well, we knew the similar patterns in the Spanish flu, but we still repeated them with this outbreak, and we've not learned from the past. Those types of things, right? Moving on from that quickly. Again, by examining the folly of this conflict, peace is the answer. By examining the folly of this conflict, you can hope to win battles by learning from the mistakes of this battle. But overall, the folly of warfare is demonstrated here. Now, what I wanted to do is use this as a little bit of a backdrop, and we do have a little bit of Shakespeare coming in. So the skeletal collection from the Battle of TOWTON is very important to us archaeologists. And just mentioning something, here we go. Anyone who watches the Game of Thrones will be aware of the writer George R.R. Martin, and that the War of the Roses inspired the Game of Thrones, the first in a series of fantasy novels about a dynastic war among several families for control of the throne of the fictional kingdom of Westeros. The Wars of the Roses were a string of English civil wars fought between two houses of the Plantagenet dynasty, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, like the wars fought in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is one of the books in the Game of Thrones, the wonderful TV series, which I've never seen, but I'm sure some of you have probably watched it, and I think it's still going now. So these armed hostilities meeting at this field of battle. Again, when I opened this lecture today, I mentioned that facts and figures change depending on which historian's notes you read. Some historians disagree with the figure of 100,000. Some say it's as low as 50,000, but I got to be honest with you, that's more than were involved at Bosworth. That's more than were involved at Culloden, Killieprankie, any of the Naseby, Marston Moor. This is a lot of people, and if you want to. And the historians have put this down to 20,000, but this is still double the amount died than at the first day of the Battle of the Somme. If you want to compare this, in comparison, between 7 and 8,000 Union and Confederate soldiers died at the Battle of Gettysburg in June 1863. So if you think that more, and the Battle of Gettysburg was over 3 days, may I say. So even those dying on this battlefield, there were more dying on this battlefield than if you combine the dead from the first Battle of the Somme on both sides and the Battle of Gettysburg. this by far is one of the greatest death tolls of a battle in history. It's not the biggest. I can quote the battle between Saladin and the Crusaders was a far greater death toll. And there are one or two Roman battles that tens of thousands of individuals die. But this itself is the worst in our history. The Lancastrians outnumbered the Yorkists, but still the Yorkists run. Written records and carefully mapped artifacts with the archaeologists have helped us piece together the events of the day, but we don't have it all. We know that we can't map hand-to-hand combat. We can't know anyone's movements really. And the poleaxe was the weapon of the day. An axe, a spike, a hammer. This is a weapon. This is, and to be honest with you, when you've mown your load over the enemy in regards to archers, you don't have any weapons other than your sword. So this is the thing that you're going to go into battle with, and it's also the same as a crossbow as well. Crossbow bolts, you're not going to have hundreds of them either. And okay, if you want to over exaggerate it, say there was whole carts full of arrows. You're going to 2,000 men are going to run through carts of arrows in no time. It's the same comparison as if you look at Islandwana with the British continually firing. It's the same thing. They're going to eventually run out, but you're not going to run out of your poleaxe. It's going to be a contemporary thing that you're going to use in the battle. With the bodies that they found, now this is individual 25. Now this individual has got padding underneath the armor, is very thin armor, and in the reconstruction you can actually see the wound on the side of his face. Now we should assume, and we can't assume, who this person is buried in the ground. If he's buried in the ground and not laid out in the field for 20 years, he's got to be aristocracy. However, after the body's been stripped, how do you know they're aristocracy anyway? You've got all these problems. When we look at the skeletal remains, we get an idea of the age group. Now, you could shout out and say, you know, these individuals, you know, they might indicate that they're from a battle, but let's have a bit more proof. And the ages of the bodies range precisely between 17 years old and 50. And then somebody said, 50, that's absolutely ridiculous. How do you have a 50-year-old with a poleaxe, fighting with a poleaxe? And I say, easy. You know, I'm 45 and I can still wield an axe quite easily. So, you know, that's no inhibition. So a 50-year-old, it might be a conditioned fighter or something. It could be anybody. And a 17-year-old, those lads picked up and tossed into the army a couple of days before. And there's another strange thing here, which is a strange fact. The older men of the collection of bodies were the tallest. I don't know why that is, but that's a strange fact. So this mass grave, again, I will repeat for the last time, we don't have mass graves like this associated with Naseby, Marston Moor Civil War. We don't. We have bodies from Culloden, but they've not been excavated. We don't know how many people are known as mass graves. So we don't. And the other thing as well is back to the St. Fagin thing as well in 1648. We're told that, you know, thousands of royalists were butchered by the parliamentarians, but where are the bodies? Many of the skeletons, peri-mortem injuries before death, so not after death, but lots of them are post hoc de proc. They're after death mutilations, and we mentioned a little bit about that. Now, there are 28 skulls that have severe wounds on them, or wounds are directly attributed to the skull. And if you want to put together all the damage on the skulls, there are 113 wounds in total on the 28 recovered skulls. And there's an image that I've missed in my collection, which I'm just going to go back. One that I missed earlier on, and somebody said, "What's that?" So we've got to go back a minute. Sorry about this. I missed it out earlier on, and I realized I missed it. I rushed forward. There it is. What they've done, they've taken a schematic plan of a skull, and they've basically put on this skull the places indicative of where the arrows are entering the skull. Now, this isn't one individual. This is a composite, and you're looking at this skull, the one in the top left-hand corner. You can see that most of these were obviously facing the enemy, and arrows were heading into the eye socket, the nose bridge, and most of these would have been fatal. But what you've got entry percussion points at the back of the skull, where what you do find is that people are being hit from behind. Some of these might be exit wounds as well, but overall, this is where they're entering into the skull. And the other interesting thing is that as people are looking side on, probably without their helmet or what have you, they're being hit from the side as well. A wound like that would be more fatal than a frontal wound, with the ones described in the top left-hand corner. And again, that's a frontal wound, the frontal lobe, and the arrangement of these bodies in front of us that we've already seen. So let's get back to where we are. And just give me a moment. And here we go. Bingo, that one there. That's that isn't that's not an armor piercing bodkin. That's going to be poleaxed into the side of the head. That's the one shown, one of the early ones found that we've seen in an earlier image. And could this have been fatal? 50-50. So what we then see is that we do find that we've got a number of wounds on the rest of people's bodies, postcranial, below the neckline, for example. An osteological exam of the skull wounds overall, the 28 wounds, the 28 skulls, the 113 wounds, suggests that 73 were caused by sharp force trauma. So in other words, force trauma, straight in there, or a bodkin. 28 were produced by blunt force trauma. So in other words, somebody on a horse, man down below, basically a battle axe or a battle hammer, smash into the side of the skull, skull caves in, job done. 12 were the result of other puncture forces, more towards the armor-piercing bodkins than the other sharp trauma that we've already mentioned. Lots of this evidence is associated with poleaxe movements in regards to the skull. So with a skull in front of us, to give you an idea of gravity, I've got 3 skulls. I got a list of 3 in front of me: skull 10, 16, and 32. Skull 10 showed 6 blows onto the head, and you're thinking, why 6? Surely TOWTON 16, 8 blows is enough to make sure the person's dead, or these people were just pissed off. And they were pissed off because the Duke of York had died not so long earlier. The house of the head of the House of York, who could have become king, but he was now dead, and the Yorkists wanted vengeance against the Lancastrians. And listen to this one, Jane. Isn't 13 blows on the head of TOWTON 32, excuse the pun, overkill? In other words, when these people had killed somebody, they kept going in there, pounding their skull to bits. We've already mentioned this, so just a bit of a recap. There we go. We've mentioned the longbowmen firing the Yorkists into the Lancastrian ranks. Lancastrians trying to retaliate. They're not really hitting the Yorkist ranks. And number two, rising casualties fought the Lancastrian army to attack the Yorkists through the arrow storm. To avoid the arrow storm, they could have just backed off further up the hill. They didn't. They decided to attack. The Yorkists advance to meet the Lancastrians, but the Lancastrians slowly gain the advantage thanks to strength and numbers. So amazingly, the Lancastrians are winning, except the carte blanche, the Duke of Norfolk and his reinforcements enter the fray on the Yorkist side in early afternoon. A bit like later on at the Battle of Waterloo, where the Prussians get involved in the battle. They start to turn the tide. The Lancastrians lose ground, fall back, and are routed. And there we go. Thousands of Lancastrian soldiers are chased and drowned as they try to escape. Their bodies create a dam across the River Cock. There was a pun I was going to use in connection with but I just don't think it's appropriate. But looking at these bodies again, you've got another wound on the right-hand side of the face. That looks like another poleaxe wound. As they're starting to remove these, they come across more and more wounds. That body is in fact put face down. That body, hang on, let's just not say that body. Let's show you. That body's placed face down. That placed face down. That's actually face up. You don't often see bodies being placed face down into this type of arrangement. You usually see them faced up. I'm not going to interpret anything there, but it's something different. And go. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to give you the epilogue now, but we will carry on for a little bit longer. And the epilogue, in a way, is this image. So you've got sort of late Renaissance artwork, and that there could be Edward on his horse, holding a lance. That would have been pretty ineffectual on this type of battle. And it's said by some historians that the very availability of Edward to be King Edward IV on the battlefield, as he would be later on that day, would lead to the victory being complete. Henry was not available. He fled to Scotland, for example. Henry would actually become king again for a very short time, and Edward would take over. It's just like that War of the Roses thing. The House of York defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, and Edward was crowned King Edward IV. He ruled for 22 years until his death in 1483. Now, I mentioned King Richard. King Richard III, who was King Edward IV's brother, also a Yorkist, assumed the throne and reigned from 1483 to 1485. There you go. Richard died at the Battle of Bosworth, leading to Richard giving way to Henry ap Tudor, Henry VII. And then what we then find is that we see that change in history that I've mentioned, the weakening of the sense of those two families, and now the Tudors are going to come into the fray. What I haven't done, folks, is the Shakespeare bit, which I've got to do, because painting what this battle means and meant to historians away from the archaeology comes a lot from historians who either like to glorify fighting or unglorify fighting. Which one was Shakespeare in regards to this battle, Jane? You might be surprised.
Say that again. Which?
Did Shakespeare glorify Towton, or give a sense of futility to warfare.
I'm going to guess. Give a sense of futility to warfare.
Completely correct, and that surprised me. Absolutely surprised me. It surprised me because I always think, when we look at when we think about his work in connection with Julius Caesar, and we think about his work in connection with Richard III, and we come across all his work, it's almost as if, and what, Macbeth, you can't get any more blood-curdly than Macbeth, when you look at all these different things. And he paints a different perspective. But before we do that, let's just look a little bit about the weapons. And what the evidence that we get from the field. Let's spit this out. So it's not just about coins and so on. So these are actually on the end of the spurs. So we know they had cavalry. So that's right. This is part of the horse bridle, maybe associated with the horse adornments that the cavalry would have worn. This is rather interesting. That is the sword guard. So we have evidence of swords, which is great. And these here, all of these, are the bases of the scabbards. So basically, you have a leather scabbard, the sword would be drawn from it, and these would be the bases of the scabbard. And interestingly enough, these are belt ends. Basically, the ends of belts would have been a piece of metal, and you would have basically you wouldn't usually have buckles for belts. What you'd have had a belt that you'd have twisted around your body, and you looped it in, and you just fastened it through. But you did have buckles when you're actually putting together the armor and all these other things. So that's a really nice collection from the battlefield, mainly found by detectorists. I will give them their credit where it's due in regards to this battle, because they have been working alongside the archaeologists. Now this, I'm not going to ask, Goff, come on, what is this?
I don't know.
This is evidence of cannon. This is a cannon that exploded on the battlefield. Okay. And you can see that this is not the best cannon made. Usually, back then there would be several pieces of metal, either in sections, or it would be a two-piece cannon. It would be bound together with straps. This is a type of cannon we're talking about, or they would try to cast it. And you can see that that's not really cast well. What would happen is, with early ordnance, they would explode on the battlefield, killing more people that fired them than actually ended up on the enemy. Because when you think about it, the blacksmith who was making these things, the blacksmith, not a cannon maker, he wouldn't care. The army's paid for the cannon, right? If it kills anybody, then, tossed to the wind. Nobody's going to be really interested. He actually gets his money. And actually, armies realize this later on. And there's cases in the Russian war with Napoleon that Russian cannons were exploding on the battlefield. And the Tsar heard about this, and he said, right, who are the cannon makers? You tell them if any more of their cannons explode, they will be executed. They are now to put their names to the cannons. And guess what? Every single cannon from that moment onwards did not explode on the battlefield. So it tells you of the mindset. And again, that answers an earlier question, really, about these things being put together quite quickly. It's just for that moment. There's that skull again. We've seen this several times. TOWTON 25, the one that's had it's healed there. That's where it's been healed, and that's where his face has been smashed in. Probably poleaxed in the side, but then it's been bludgeoned in with the axe, totally smashed in. Whoever killed this individual, it may have actually been a Lancastrian killing a Yorkist. I've said the whole lecture it's mainly been the other way around, but Yorkists are dying on the battlefield again. This important figure, and whenever you're reading articles like this, sometimes check the dates. It occurred in 1461, not 1471. So look at that. The entire side of the face has been bludgeoned in. It's a hell of a state. The full skull exhibited a healed wound to the lower mandible from a heavy blow to the side of the head with a sword-like implement. The sword, the wound was at least 10 years old, and the facial wound would have been extensive. But the person survived. He lived for 10 years until the battle. The soldier would have received some medical treatment, but a rough scar may have remained. That's amazing. He survived. Again, proving the point that they had an idea of disease and they had an idea of infection. If they didn't, that guy would have died. Archaeological proof for something that we've denied. So we've seen this skull time and time again. We don't need that. And again, this is that idea of what Chris said. They're all wearing armor, but they're not. This is being painted. I think this one, this is by a John Courtley, and I think this is being done sometime in the earlier part of the 1800s. And again, this is glorifying not what Shakespeare did. This is glorifying the battle, and you're seeing Edward going in there, right? There's Edward there. He's going in there. He wouldn't have been like this. He would have been at the back of the line. The only person that you could probably safely identify in that battlefield is commanders and the king himself. Other than that, and by the way, you could probably kill the king and not realize he was the king because you had no idea what was going on. So now we're down at Shakespeare's legs, and this is the last thing we're going to look at today. Interestingly enough, we're not going to pass 1 o'clock in this lecture. Whoa. In the late 1500s, William Shakespeare wrote a number of dramatizations of historic figures. The use of history as a backdrop against which the familiar characters act out Shakespeare's drama lends a sense of realism to his plays, and this is one of them. Shakespeare wrote a 3-part play about Henry VI, relying heavily on King Hal's chronicle as a source. His vision of the Battle of TOWTON, touted as the bloodiest engagement in the War of the Roses, tick, correct, became a set piece about the terror of civil war, a national terror that is essentially familiar, a familiar sense of what the people felt. The historian Wolfe said it was thanks to Shakespeare's dramatization of the battle that the weak and ineffectual Henry was at least remembered by English society as the weak, ineffectual figure that he actually was. It was his chronicle that led to this, and this is what it's proved out to be. Unlike his painting of Richard III, which is wholly inaccurate, albeit for his, and it's also, it's said that Henry would have preferred to have been a shepherd rather than a king. Now, this is where this illustration comes in, painted probably about 1760 by Francois Gravelotte in connection with this play. Shakespeare's version of the battle presents a notable scene that comes immediately after Henry's loss. Henry witnesses the laments of 2 soldiers in the battle. Now, this is key to the play. Hairs on the back of the neck. One slays his opponent, which is this figure, in hope of plunder. So this individual's killing this individual in hope that he can gain in the battle, only to find the victim is his son. So that's his son. So father kills son in battle. The other kills his enemy. So here we go, who turns out to be his father. So son on the Lancastrian side kills his Yorkist father. And Shakespeare in the play is meant to be saying both killers have acted out of greed and fell into a state of deep grieving after discovering their misdeeds. Another Shakespearean scholar, Rossiter, names the scene as the most notable of playwrights' written rituals. So in other words, this bears out an alternation to his other plays. Shakespeare uses anonymous fictional characters to illustrate the ills of civil war, while historical king reflects on their fates. And there's the king there, and he's reflecting on his fates. if you want to re-examine this lecture, and if you want to re-examine any of the historians' works, this is an event of voices of combatants. The common soldier's sense of perspective is what we've spoken about today. The legacy of this is that we could have only hoped that there would be never another battle like this again. There were battles, more and more, in English history, British history. And where Shakespeare wanted to warn against the ills of battle, we then see a bloody civil war where thousands are then killed. The Civil War of the 1640s. But before that point, we get the kings like Henry. We get wars against the Scots. And always warfare is futile, but we never learn as human beings. And I don't think we've even learned today. So on that somber note, let's see if you'd like, Jane, would you like to say anything?
No, I'm not really a battle kind of person, but that was quite interesting.
I got to say, Jane, well, I'll say that and you come in. I got to say that the danger to looking at battles like this is that people are going to say they're not interested in warfare. But the understatement is that this has stated the following of our history. Okay, if I did say, for example, the Battle of Bannockburn, you know, that probably wouldn't have been as accessible to understand our history as this one. So this is why I've chosen this. So go on, Jane.
I've forgotten what I was going to say now. I still don't quite understand why the Duke of Norfolk joined in with the Yorkists.
The Duke of basically, I think I think the Yorkists may have turned around and said, "Look, you know, we want to settle this," and that was noted in my notes somewhere. We want to settle this. We want to end this. We want anyone to get to the battle from any part of Britain, and we just want to get them involved. Scots, Welsh, Irish, English, they're all there. This is going to be the battle of the nations. This is going to be Napoleon's Leipzig or Auschwitz. This is going to be Austerlitz. Or this is going to be the big battle. This is going to be the Waterloo. But it never turned out to be that. And that's why the Duke of Norfolk's involved. He, like anyone, wants to see an end to the war, and he's just going to join in. And he happened to be joining in on the Yorkish side and not the Lancastrians.
Okay.
So, Goff, anything?
No, it's very interesting. It's very well documented, isn't it? It must be well researched, that battle.
Very, very well. And this is why the reason why television archaeologists like to do things like this is there's a lot of information out there. The reason why Time Team started to fail is they started to do projects that they didn't have much information on, instead of doing the things that they could get people connected with. And that was one of the later failings of Time Team. But when Pollard and our Scots bloke, whose name's gone out my head, Neil Oliver, they chose this as one of their episodes, and it really hit Neil Oliver, and this is why he's become a great star. I'd just like to mention before I open up the mics, don't forget next week, what we're doing next week, Easter Island, which will be something very different. See you in the forum Wednesdays and Saturdays, and let's see if there are any questions. Everyone put their mics on. Karen, Jim, put yours on last. So, Chris, anything you would like to say?
Hang on. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah, a couple of points. Were there any other wounds on the bodies
yes,
apart from head wounds?
Postcranial, yes, lower part of the body, yeah.
There were there?
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the older men were taller. Could that have been because they had a better diet and there were perhaps, I don't know, nobles and people who were smaller?
Yeah,
had less food.
Yeah, I actually thought that was absolutely fascinating, and that point being made, and I didn't want to draw on that because there are so many implications of drawing on that one, but maybe you are right, but I think I'm not going to say anymore. I don't want to, because I could get into a racial stereotype of you know, and classes and races and stuff. I don't want to do that. But yeah, yeah, I would agree with you on that. Yeah. So
Thank you.
what about you, Keithy Babes?
No, I think nothing to add there, really. No, apart from saying probably all the little ones are obviously Welshmen.
Oh, well, that's it then. So yeah, thank you. So we've done Jay, we've done Goff, and what about you, Susie Q? We haven't heard from Terry today. Never mind. Right, okay, Karen and Kathy, anything?
Oh, it's not even worth it.
No, nothing. Very interesting.
Thank you. And let's hear from Jim and the other Chrissy Babes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, you said the body sustained several wounds. Well, could they happen during the battle? The person was dead and the arrows were sort of falling on them still.
Actually, that's something else that I've not come across. And yes, you are right. You've got the idea. For example, when you look at the likes of Islander, not Islander one, when you look at the likes of Rorke's Drift, lots of the wounds that you might see in regards to the Zulus may have actually been called secondary after death because there were so many of them on the field. So yeah, I would go with that. Yeah. So yes. What about you, Chris? Anything with Jim?
Excuse me.
No, not so. No, very interesting. A lot of food for thought there. Yeah.
Definitely. So we've done Kathy and Karen, and finally, I'd like to hear from Terry. Terry, anything you'd like to say?
Oh, hi, Terry. Right. Yes, my dear. I found it interesting. A bit gory, but very interesting.
That's good to hear from you. And also, what about you, Sue?
I'm a little bit faint, and I had to have the smelling salts about 20 times.
Well, that's okay. Are you sure it wasn't snuff?
No, it was definitely smelling.
So before yeah, go on, carry on.
But was there any outcome measured up as?
Right, we're not getting this, but you saying the outcome is basically Edward, but there is still a war between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists until it ends in 1485. Is that what you're asking?
Okie dokie.
So what I'm going to say quickly, our community support officer went with me on Monday. She ripped her dress, damaged her trousers. We went to find the Wenvo tunnel. Her husband wasn't too pleased, but we've got some wonderful videos online about us finding the Wenvo train tunnel, which might not be of interest to some, but we had a great exploration. So those videos will be going out in the next few days. And other than that, looking forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks for your continued support. And if anyone wants to chat at the end, they may do so. But what I'm going to do, I had to mute Chris's and Karen's while Sue spoke. So if you want to unmute and say goodbye, many thanks, folks. So I'm going to say goodbye to Karen, Kathy, Chris, Jim, the other Chris, Goff, Sue, Terry, Jane, and Keith. And I'll see you all next week. Take care, people.
Cheerio, bye. Bye, Daddy. Bye, Daddy.
Bye, son.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye-bye, daughter. Bye-bye.
Daddy.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Yeah, it's good to be called Daddy. Jim's my adoptive son as well. He's my love child. See you guys. Take care. Anyway, great. Got saw the message, Jim, as well. Thank you very much.